Well, good afternoon, listeners. You're listening to Lament of Hope podcast. And I'm really excited. For those of you who've been following the podcast for a while, you do know that I love shows from like the 1970s, the 1980s. Those are the TV shows I watch. So I'm really bad if you ask me about TV shows now, but I'm really good if you ask me about TV shows back then. So I really, really, really enjoy the Waltons, and I've watched a lot of the seasons. I'm almost watched every episode. Um, and I love the family unit. I love the topics it addresses, and it's been a big encouragement for me. Well, my guest today is Cami Cotler, and she played the youngest child in the Walton family, Elizabeth. So I'm just really excited to get to connect with her and talk with her because her role as Elizabeth has kind of become a huge factor of her life. So, um, Cami, first of all, thank you so much for taking the time to be on here.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for reaching out.
Well, to kind of start out, I want to ask you because I've always wondered for you, like, do you like being known for one role? Because it's definitely, I mean, your role is definitely very unique and it's a very special series and it's passed down and so many people know about it. But did you ever want to be able to branch out and do more where it wasn't just being known for Elizabeth Walton, or do you really love the fact that you're known for one particular character?
I think it doesn't bother me. I think because I didn't continue as an actor, it might have been less of an issue in my life than it might have been in some other folks. I think, when you're growing up in a role, uh, and you're developing your own identity, right? As you go from being a 6-year-old to a 16-year-old, I think just like any teenager or preteen spends time thinking about like, who am I and how do I want to present to the world and what does that person think of me and how do I want to change how I appear? I mean, playing a character on television at the same time, I think adds a dimension to that
Hmm.
because you also want people in your real life to know your real person and to be able to differentiate between the character and who you are. So I think that was probably more of a challenge than being known for being Elizabeth because I grew up and went on to do other things with my life. Like most people know me as a school leader, right? Like people in my world. Um,
Well,
so so that's how I feel known, if that makes sense. And then there's this other thing from my past, which is that I was Elizabeth, which is also kind of a cool benefit that I get to like step into when I feel like.
so when you talk about school leader, what exactly does that mean?
Well, when the show ended, I ended up going into education. I got my teaching credential and taught high school and English and history for a while, and then eventually kind of fell into helping to start a school, start
Oh,
an
wow.
elementary that was a K-8 charter school in Southern California. And then because this was the early days of the charter school movement, there weren't a lot of charter leaders out there who were experienced and qualified, or even administrators interested in leading a charter school. And as a result, one of the other parents and myself ended up kind of temporarily running the school for 3 years. So we
Wow.
kind of being the founding co-directors and being on the steep learning curve of how do we do this. Uh, and that was really a fascinating experience. And when I returned to the school where I'd been teaching, they were ready to open a middle school. So they asked if I would help develop that educational program and get that school started. And then eventually I became the founding principal of that school.
Wow.
So
Why do you like what's your passion for education? Because I've talked to a lot of teachers, and the ones that are really good teachers and the ones who stay the most are the ones who just love the children and love teaching, even though it's super hard. Like,
yeah, I think that's true. I think for me, as a young person, it started kind of first of all, I was very fortunate. I had wonderful teachers. So I definitely had a feeling that people were entitled to really creative and meaningful school experiences. So that was interesting. And I think also because I was an American Studies major, I wanted to pursue a career that would let me live in different parts of the United States so I could
hmm,
explore that. and teaching, like a California teaching credential will do that. Um, so I was interested in that. And then when I started teaching, you know, teaching is a little bit like acting because you are performing, and there are moments where you're like, oh, okay, I need to shift the energy in order to get this room to pay attention to me. And I think having been an actor gives you a toolbox, to reach into, and you're not afraid to look silly, right? You're like, oh, yeah, here we go. Um, and then I like to problem solve, and I get bored really easily. So teaching is never boring. They're always doing something you don't expect, and things are changing all the time. So that worked. And I also like to collaborate, which I think I definitely got from being on the Waltons because it was such a collaborative setting. So I like having a group of people all working together to do
Mm.
something. And then to me, certainly as a 20 something, it seemed like, well, and it would be meaningful. It would be important. It's not like we're all working really hard to like sell a car. We're working really hard
Yeah.
to, to teach people and empower them and make them stronger thinkers and better citizens. And that seems like I would feel good about a hard day's work at the end of it.
Is is there something about education? Do you think education has progressed really well, teaching education, or do you feel like it's lacking from when you were in your 20s starting to teach?
Well, it's important to remember, I mean, teaching is weird. Education is a weird field because in some ways, it doesn't change at all. I remember having an education professor say that if Plato was time traveled suddenly to the 20th century, he would be baffled by almost everything he saw except for a classroom. He'd be like, "Oh, this is a classroom."
Hmm.
So some of it stays very much the same as it has been for thousands of years, right? Which is a person in a room with other people trying in some way to transmit information.
Yeah.
That that's really been the same. And of course, things like technology have shifted. Um, and I think the influence of kind of business studies and how do you use data to make informed decisions is kind of newer in education. Disabilities rights has changed education. Classrooms are way more diverse than they used to be because you've got people of all different kind of neurotypes in the same room in a way that you wouldn't have had 50 years ago.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, I mean it's like I say, it's never boring.
Is there an aspect of it that you don't enjoy very much?
It's not funded well enough. I mean,
Yeah.
that's a perpetual struggle, right? You have to teach all the children, so a lot of people need the service, and it's paid for through tax dollars, and people don't particularly enjoy having their taxes raised, but I think there's no question that the thing that makes it hardest is there's not enough resources to give all the kids what they need.
Yeah, and when you're talking about what they need, do you mean like additional like extracurricular programs or just the programs that are already in place don't have enough funding to do the things you really want to do with them?
I think it's yes to both of those things.
Okay.
I think that, you know, people learn in really different ways. Um, and people who are really good at teaching, and I was an okay teacher, I was pretty good, but I've seen people who are extraordinary. And what they do is very hard work and it's very sophisticated and it's incredibly nuanced. And there's so many ways additional resources would make their lives easier. If they always knew that the copy machine would work, if they were able to buy whatever books or materials they wanted, if their class sizes could be a bit smaller, if they could have an additional, paraeducator in the room to support them, if so
Hmm.
those things for sure, just in the general educational classroom. And then when you add to it, schools are like the easiest ways for the state to provide support, right? So um, kids get fed at school. Kids receive mental health services at school. Kids are screened for vision and hearing at school.
Yeah.
So there are all these additional responsibilities. And then coming out of the pandemic, um, we where we see kids need so much more than they did before that. In terms of, there are definitely children who had really traumatic experiences of losing loved ones. There are
Hmm.
definitely children who struggled because their parents had to go to work and couldn't avoid, being out when it didn't feel safe. And there are children who lost people close to them. And then there are children who just were at home without their peers for a year and a half.
Yeah.
So that all increases the kinds of needs they have that, you know, they they grow bigger no matter what. And so they roll in as like a 13-year-old, but socially and emotionally, they're still closer to 11 and a half or 12. And that's hard. It's hard to be that person.
I know some people would say to you, why don't the families just provide these things for them as opposed to the school having to provide more of, as you were saying, some medical resources, food. Um, I mean, how would you answer that? Because I know a lot of children, like you said, come from very hard backgrounds. So a lot of them don't even have money for lunch or have food at home where they can get lunch. How do you respond to that as you've been in the teaching field so long?
My experience with parents is most of them are trying really, really hard to do the best they can. Um,
Hmm.
like we definitely have parents who it's very difficult for them to come in for a parent teacher conference because they're working two jobs to make the rent and they can't afford to take an afternoon off because then they don't pay their rent. So in my experience, most folks are working really hard and doing the best they can.
Hmm.
Um, and even for parents who were really struggling, in situations of neglect, frequently when you dive deeper into the situation, you find out, okay, so we don't think they're caring for their child sufficiently, but they have an elderly parent at home who's dying, or they have, I tell teachers all the time, like when you're frustrated with a parent, it's very possible that when they come in and talk to you, you're going to discover that there are just other things that have been more pressing. And it's kind of your job as an educator to be like, I need you to move your child's situation to the top of your list of emergencies because
Hmm.
they're just so many competing emergencies.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, on the whole, I worked at when I was teaching, I worked at an at-risk program for kids who were more likely than other kids to drop out of high school.
Hmm.
Whenever a kid started acting up or being difficult, the teaching team would always pull that kid in after classes had stopped for like, hey, what's going on? And as a young teacher, invariably, what we found out was that whatever was going on was so difficult that my perspective always shifted from, God, this kid is being such a butt, and why are they being so difficult and driving me crazy, to, oh, I can't believe they even came to school. Like, how did they get out of bed in the morning? Like, wow. So in my experience, 9 times out of 10, if somebody's struggling, there's usually a pretty good reason.
And you think that this is in part why the school has had to take on so many more additional roles beyond just like mental education.
In part, you can't, I mean, mental education does not occur if you're hungry,
Yeah.
right? Mental education does not occur if you just watched violence at home. Mental education, like if you don't feel safe, if you aren't having your basic human needs met, it's a rare child who's going to then be successful in a
Yeah.
school setting. It's rare human, like grown-ups can't do it either, right?
Yeah.
So yeah,
Do you have a particular, I mean, I'm sure there's, certain things like you can't say names and stuff, but do you have a particular story maybe that would represent well what you're talking about for the audience?
I had a child once who was being difficult, who when we finally spoke to them, we discovered that a step parent who had been imprisoned was being released and was coming home. And they were looking, so the student was looking for a place to live.
Hmm.
And the reason the student was looking for a place to live was the step parent could not legally reside with the child because they'd gone to prison for acts against the child. So they were essentially rendered homeless because, yeah, it was an insane situation. It was inconceivable, right?
The child,
Um,
and you're saying the child was the one that was homeless because the parent was coming home.
yeah.
Hmm.
And the other parent had made a decision, right? The spouse over the child. Um,
Wow.
so yeah, there and sometimes it's just, that was particularly extraordinary. But then a lot of times it's very simple. It's, parents are working two jobs and the house is a two-bedroom, but there's six people living there and the rent is very high because they're living in a city where rents are high. I mean, it's just I mean, one of the things that I always thought was interesting about the Waltons was you don't typically see portrayals of families with money troubles on television.
It's
Television
true.
mostly represents folks who are well off or very rich.
Hmm.
Um, so I always wonder if part of the appeal of our show was that we were at least acknowledging that people sometimes have to, and the Waltons for people in the Depression were doing well, right? They had a lot of self-sufficiency because they could, they had a cow and they had a garden.
Yeah.
Uh,
And food, food
yeah.
every day.
And then
Yeah.
back then, if you wanted to go hunting in the mountains, you could bring back venison or you could bring back turkey. So there was a lot of capacity to live independently, both in terms of the skills they had and the resources that were available to them. But then they did struggle to, get a new hot water heater or buy a new pair of glasses for grandma or those kinds of expenses. And I always thought it struck me later as an adult that that's not usually what television brings.
It's funny because even now, though, watching the Waltons, you relate to it a lot because there are still things you can't, like buying glasses, for instance. I mean, that's a couple $100, and sometimes you can't afford that right now. You got a budget for it a couple months from now. Or for a water heater, maybe $1,000, and that's like 6 months of your salary having to be saved, put aside for you to be able to even purchase that. So I think in some ways, like you said, I mean, I found that super relatable too, because I've never really been, for the majority of my life, I've always been in a situation where I had to decide between one thing or the other. It's like, do I put this off for a while or do I get this because I can't afford both? And so I think in that way, like you said, it's interesting. And maybe, I mean, I want to ask you this too. Like, do you notice for you, like the older shows? I don't want to put new shows down at all, but I just find that the older shows have always been more relatable, which is I think why I enjoy them so much. I just enjoy the humanity of it, and it's less about the effects or the cinematography or the music. It's much more about the people. And I guess I just relate to that more as an audience member. I mean, for you, how do you feel about that? Do you enjoy older shows more, or do you believe that like seeing newer shows, you see a lot of improvements that you actually think are beneficial for a viewing audience? What do you think about that?
I mean, I like both. I'm in a weird place because I grew up on a TV set.
Yeah.
So since I was a little kid, I'd be like, oh, look at the lighting, nice, or look at the costuming, or oh, look at the fabulous ad. Like, so I perceive a lot of it from kind of a technical lens.
Hmm.
Like, and there's so much, I think there's a lot of product makers are investing a lot of money right now because they're kind of fighting for market share in a brand new world of streaming. Um, which means I see productions and I'm just astonished at how much money is on the screen. Um,
Hmm.
just in terms of, sets and locations and time. Like I mean, we shot an hour of television in like 6.5 days, 7 days. Um, so I'm from a maker of television lens. I'm impressed with all the resource. I'm also there's some fabulous writing and there's some fabulous acting and it's all a bit edgier, right? Because you don't before you used to have three networks and they were broadcast freely and therefore there were a lot of limits on what you could do. So things are racier, um, which has never bothered me. Um, but then I'm also aware of kind of the pacing of earlier shows. Like I stumbled across a Andy Griffith show the other day. I thought it's so languid, the pace at which it moves.
Yeah.
And the characters are so explicit. Like all the actors are like doing a beautiful job being like the mayor or just it's the farmer. They're really masterful in terms of quickly communicating the entire character. Like we know exactly what's going on.
Yeah.
And then the decision to let Andy Griffith kind of sit in the background, kind of understated and quiet, but the smartest and rightest of everyone all the time. Um, so I like both.
Do you have, I mean, is The Waltons your favorite older show, or do you have another show you like better?
No, the Waltons is not, the Waltons is different for me to view than for you to view, right? Because when I view it, I see, puberty. I see,
Yeah.
if I do watch the show, I like to watch when I'm little. So when I'm 6 or 7, I'm completely unconscious and it's easy for me to watch. And the early shows, we were really fortunate. We had, a lot of kind of classic Hollywood crew members. So our cinematographer, Russell Meddy, had worked with Orson Welles and Douglas Sirk, and so he'd done gorgeous feature films, and he was doing really intentional, moody lighting to kind of create the sense of time period. And our costume designer, the first years, a couple of years, was lovely and passionate about costume design, and went on to, be nominated for Oscars in the movies. So we're really fortunate that we had people around who were real, top-notch craftspeople. Um, and so I like to watch the show, the early ones, because then I'm not self-conscious about my performance. And I can see, oh, look at the shadows, look at the time they took to like make it look so cool. So that's
Hmm.
fun.
But you don't like when you're older.
Well, I mean, do you like looking at pictures of yourself when you were 12?
No.
No. All you see is like, oh, I'm so
To be
awkward.
honest, I was kind of like, I always went, no, pictures. You can't see a lot of pictures when I was 12.
Right. Whereas I've got like hours of me moving around saying dialogue. So I mostly am thinking, oh, like I can tell that I don't know what to do with my arms in that scene, or I'm thinking, what's up with my bangs? Like, why didn't anybody fix my bangs? They're crazy. So that's where my head goes.
What show do you like better than the Waltons to watch?
I I kind of just bounce around older shows. Like, I love watching I Love Lucy. I grew up with it, so it's
Yeah.
like a comfortable sweater. Um, but then I also enjoy watching like the well put together shows from when I was a little bit older, like Mary Tyler Moore's show, or MASH, where they have it going on. They're well written, the performances are great, and they're just cranking it out. And I think that's another thing to think about, right? Like we did 25 episodes in a season,
Yeah.
right? And currently series are doing 9 episodes in a season. So they have a lot of luxury in terms of taking time, and yeah. It must be. I wonder if it's boring on set. Like, when I was a little kid, I used to wander around the Warner Brothers studio where we filmed, because I sort of felt like I owned the place. And I used to go on to other sound stages, and I remember going on to some sound stage of some feature film. I forget even remember what it was, and being like, everybody's just standing around, like it's so slow. Like they've been lighting for like 15 minutes, and the actors are slowly getting makeup, and on a TV series, you're like, fast as you can get it done, keep it moving. So I wonder if today's shows, because they have more time,
Hmm.
if it's boring on their sets.
That's interesting. I never thought of that. It's true though. You guys, I was slightly surprised by that. You guys did. But then again, I guess Little House on the Prairie also did like 20 episodes a season. They did a lot too. Um, did you have something, because the Waltons did address some pretty poignant issues. You guys did have like a lot of adolescent troubles, obviously, but also some pretty hard-hitting things. Um, Religion was, politics, marriage, um, difficulties in a marriage, lots of things.
Yeah.
Did you, was there something in the Waltons that you wish had been addressed, but maybe couldn't have? I mean, based on the time or based on, just the resources, whatever it was. But is there something that you wish could have been addressed in the series that wasn't touched on?
That's an interesting question. And there's nothing like it that I've thought about, like, oh, if only we'd covered this topic. Um, the I think it's pretty interesting how many substantial topics got addressed. Like you
Yeah.
say, relationships, a lot of issues of bias, like being frightened of the people from the carnival and judging them harshly, and then realizing actually they're just people too. And I think a lot of the episodes kind of concluded with that message of, hey, we're all human
Yeah.
and we're all doing the best we can. And even though we might be different, have different religions or different belief systems or different values or different ways of dressing, basically we have more in common than we have that separates us.
Well,
And I
that
feel
it
like
was
that,
even for your parents, because your parents didn't agree on, your dad didn't have the same religious feelings that your mom did.
yeah, yeah, he was not interested in going to church every Sunday. And in fact, the creator of the show, Earl Hamner, um, who came up with the story and it's based on his family, tells that that's exactly what his household was like.
Hmm.
His dad would kind of walk past the church whistling on a Sunday with his fishing pole, singing, shall we gather at the river as he was heading down to the Rockfish River to go fishing. But clearly a deeply moral character, right? Somebody who's doing his very
Right.
best and makes mistakes and apologizes for them and is thinking and trying to be a good person, even if he's not attending church regularly. I mean, the show included, we had a Jewish refugee family come onto the mountain and kind of hide their religion because they were frightened of being persecuted. We had an entire episode about Hitler's rise in Germany and whether or
Hmm.
not you should be printing the things he was writing, whether that was somehow approving of them or whether that was educating people. And in that episode, there's a book burning that gets stopped. So it shows how people can get upset and frightened and carried away and make poor decisions. Uh,
Yeah.
so there, yeah, I agree. There's a lot of really important content that's just as relevant today as it was in the 70s.
So there's not, you don't think there's one that comes to mind really that you wish was in there that wasn't?
That's never, it's never been anything I've thought about in terms of like issues. I have thought about weather because I got to live in Virginia for a while. And the biggest thing that I kind of took away from that was, oh, there's weather here. Like we should have had freezes and we should have had floods and we should have had swell, like there should have been more. In fact, the county where Earl grew up is, I think, still holds the record for the most rain to fall in 24 hours in like North America.
Wow.
Um, so they had a tropical storm stall over their county and like dozens of people died. So those kinds of like struggles of how do you survive? Because we shot it all in Los Angeles where there is no weather. And I grew up with no weather, so it wouldn't have occurred to me that weather, was a thing. So yeah, I think that was always the most obvious gap
Hmm.
in our realism. We needed more weather.
It's so funny because when I think about Little House, they had so much of that.
Did they?
Maybe. Yeah, so when you just oppose the two, it's funny because they had a ton of episodes where like there was fire, there was floods, there was blizzards. Literally every season you had something and someone died and it was very tragic and you would be so sad. So I
Well,
guess in some ways that was relieving with the Waltons. You're like, at least there's no climate things going on.
because we had fires, but
That's true.
we had like one snowstorm, but snow is hard to do. I mean, I suppose Little House, I mean, I love the Laura Ingalls Wilder's books and read them a million times each. So there's like a whole book about the long winter and the impact of the blizzard. But they shot in Simi Valley. They didn't really have weather either.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how they did it differently, but that's interesting to notice. I never thought about that with the Waltons. Um, with your kids, um, just I was thinking, did the parenting style of the Waltons, because you were growing up, you had your parents, but then you almost had these movie parents, so you had a second pair of parents.
Mhm.
When you had your kids, did you parent more, you think, like your biological parents or like the movie parents?
Um, that's an interesting question. People ask a lot whether the stories on the show it affected like my own values. And I always have to remind people that my experience of the Waltons is different than the viewers. So whereas you experienced like an hour-long story, I experienced 7 days of shooting something out of sequence.
Right.
So if my parenting was going to be influenced by my time in the Waltons, it would have more to do with with my working relationships with the adults on the set
Hmm.
than the stories of the Waltons and like how John and Olivia parented. And indeed, when I was little, because my mom, I've like the best mom. I won the mom lottery. She's fab. But she's also super logical. Um, so when sometimes I got, oh, what was me, as a young woman, she would explicitly say, maybe you should talk to Michael about it. Because Michael is, just a huge heart and loads of empathy and very, very feeling. And so she would be, she's sort of better suited temperamentally to just empathize with somebody who is having big 13-year-old emotions.
Hmm.
Whereas my mom was more like, okay, what's the problem and how do we fix it? If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think being with the adults on the show was such a benefit because I got to meet all kinds of different people from all kinds of different places. And that's both the actors and the crew members. If the show hadn't have happened, I would have been a little girl in a little suburb in Orange County, and I would have had a very sheltered upbringing. But because I was on set, I met people from all parts of the United States and people with all different value systems and ways of living and experiences, and it was amazingly enriching.
Now, do you parent more practically like your mom?
Um, I parent, I try to parent really realistically. Like I try to be aware of what my strengths and weaknesses are
Hmm.
and make decisions based on what's most likely to happen. Because I think it's important to be as consistent as you can.
Yeah.
So I was like, all right, I'm not going to hover because I'm just not a hover. I'm not a person who will do that. So how do I create an environment? And what are the most important things to me? I think it helped that I taught because when you teach, you begin to figure out that kids can sense what you really care about and what you don't really care about. So if
That's
you
true.
set up a rule in your classroom, but it's not that important to you, you're not going to reliably reinforce that rule.
Hmm.
So making sure that whatever the rules are, they resonate with how you actually feel. And I think that carried on into parenting. Like how do I feel about what they're doing right now? I'm a little uncomfortable. I feel like people are watching. Am I making a parenting decision because I'm embarrassed or because it's actually they're doing something that I think is unsafe or hurtful?
Hmm.
And then adjusting from there. Like I always say, in our living room, everything was either unbreakable or broken. So the rules were limited, like don't stand on the coffee table and don't put things in the VCR. Like those were the two living room rules. And everything else, I'm not going to worry about because I know I won't be consistent if I try to worry about it. So I might as well just let it flow. And it's just like when my kids were out doing stuff, I'm like, is this going to require an emergency room visit? Because you can't do it if we might have to go to the emergency room. But otherwise, as long as you aren't hurting anybody, if it's going to result in a skin knee, you will learn more from the skin knee than me telling you.
Hmm. I like that. I've actually never heard anyone say it that way before.
I mean, I think it went okay.
That's
Yeah.
good. I was,
And
I
I think,
want, oh,
yeah,
go ahead.
I was just gonna say, for parenting, I think you go into it imagining you're gonna have all this power, right? Like it's really typical for somebody without kids to be like in a restaurant and think, "Oh, I can't believe how those children are behaving. My children will never do that." And then your children
It's true.
come and they're full on their own people when they show up. Like from the moment they come out of your body, they are people with their own opinions and their own ways of doing things. And you're just kind of trying to like keep them safe and give them good information and gently guide them. But you aren't going to radically change any of it.
Yeah.
But then you think you're going to from the get-go. And then you realize, oh, like my son used to be super cautious in playgrounds. Like as a toddler, was always really careful. And I'd be like, oh, that's our parenting because we're kind of hands off. So he's bumped his knee and so he knows how to be careful. That's us. We did such a good job parenting that he's careful on the playground. And then my daughter was born and would jump off of bridges. I mean, completely reckless. I thought, oh, actually, it wasn't that at all. It's him. He came careful and she came reckless. And And all I can do is try to make sure she doesn't kill herself, really.
Yeah, and also, as you said, it's parenting to a personality, which has to be different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Parenting and pregnancy are all about you come into it with an idea of how it's going to be, and it's not going to be that way. So how well do you adjust to the reality on the ground,
Hmm.
right? So women will get very upset. I thought my pregnancy was going to like, or I thought my childbirth was going to go exactly like this. Like, don't like you can have a plan, but you have to be willing to abandon the plan when you realize, okay, that's not how it's going to unfold. And how do I used to, when I was a principal, I would meet with the kindergarten parents every year at the beginning of the year because it saved me time because they bring their kinder and they're like, oh, here's this perfect child I've made. I've made this perfect child. And I had a meeting at the beginning there and say, look, it's over, right? You've sent them off to kindergarten. They're going to learn how to make fart noises with their armpit. They're going to learn stupid poo-poo jokes. You may have fully sheltered them so they don't know Barney. They're going to find out who Barney is. They're going to get lice. They may end up with pinworms. They may have round, like all these things are going to happen to your perfect child. So your job is to be cool about it, is to when like a little worm crawls out your kid's butt, don't freak out. You have to be like, I'm a parent and I got this and you're going to be okay and we're going to handle it.
Hmm.
So get over all your heebie-jeebies and get your freak out right now here in this room with me. Because I'm telling you, it's not going to be exactly how you imagined it. And responding gracefully is how you build their confidence in you and make them feel secure.
That's so true. And also just to have confident children. It's interesting to see the difference, and I have when I see, and it's hard to blame parents because my tendency too is to be fearful.
Mm.
So seeing a fearful parent and then seeing, I mean, I don't know if you've been seeing these videos, but there's been these like videos on social media where a child will bang their head or like pretend to bang their head. And then how the parent reacts is how the child will react to the incident. So if the parent's freaking out, the child will scream and cry. But if the parent's just taking it very calmly, the child doesn't even cry, like doesn't even register as like, wow, that was really bad or painful. And, for you though, was it the teaching background that allowed you to have that? Or when you came into parenting, were you more fearful? And then over time, you were like, this is just not going to work.
I mean, I think at some point in time, I realized that there was way more information flowing to me than had flowed to my mother,
Yeah.
right? When I was born, there was a single book, basically, you could read about parenting,
Hmm.
and hardly anybody read it, I don't think. And then by the time I was pregnant, there were hundreds of books and lots of opinions. And I did enormous research initially, like, I'm going to do this the best way. And I researched and researched and researched. And then I kind of begin to realize, well, like for example, what sort of sleeping situation? How do you handle children's sleep, like infants? Do you put them in a crib in the next room, or do you put them in a bassinet in your room, or do you put them on the bed with you? Like, what's the right thing to do?
Hmm.
And I researched it and researched and I made a decision. And then I was so tired when my son was born because I was in labor for like 2 days. So I was already out 48 hours of sleep when he came home. And then, infants wake up every 2.5 hours.
Yes.
And the books say, oh, it's actually a form of torture. Like in the military, they've done studies and you lose your mind if you don't sleep. But that's all the books say. They don't explain like how do you survive? And then I was trying to follow my plan and went to get him in 3 a.m. and took him back to sit in the bed and nurse him, and I fell asleep.
Oh.
I slept through his nursing and to the next one, and I thought, okay, well, I think anything that gets me more sleep is good because it would be really bad for him if I died, and this is going to kill me. And I tell parents that all the time, like whatever intellectual notion you have about how things ought to be, you have to survive to do the parenting, right? If it's killing you and it's killing your family, stop and rethink it because people get very doctrinaire about their parenting philosophy, and kids are all different, you know?
Yeah.
What works for one doesn't work for the other, and being willing to be kind of humble and try things and see how it goes And also acknowledge that you're gonna make mistakes. No parent does it 100% right, you
Yeah.
know? So you will fail and you will make mistakes and you can just do your best and kind of be give yourself grace, give your child grace.
Is there anything in particular you regret about parenting that you wish you had done differently?
Hmm. I don't think, no. I mean, like I said, you're going to make mistakes and it's not going to be perfect. I mean, I think there's some things I wished I'd figured out earlier. But we did okay. Our kids are okay. You know, they're living independently and they're not hurting anybody and they're fun to be around. And I think that's a pretty good outcome.
Yeah. Because I want to be respectful of your time because I know we're almost at 4 here, but I wanted to ask, what do you what is one thing about parents that you see now, just in your experience of education, but also just living as a parent, um, that you find sad about kind of the family structure or parenting now? Like, is there something you wish was different or that parents saw differently, that you just see so much of something and you wish it was different, maybe for the sake of the kids or just for the sake of the family unit in general? Is there something that you think should be greatly improved, or something that just makes you sad that that's how families operate now? Or
I think like you said, there's a lot of fear. Um, and I don't actually, I'm not convinced that the world is that much more dangerous than when I was little.
mm,
I think there's a 24-hour news cycle, so everything gets shared now. And then you add new social media, right? So the worst outcomes get shared all the time.
yeah,
Um, and and that has to be distorting for the life of the family and the child, right? Like I used to let my kids walk around the block. When I was a kid, I walked around the block. And I would, when they had play dates, I'd have to call families and be like, hey, just I want to let you know that my children are allowed to walk around the block. Is that something you're going to be comfortable with your child doing with them?
hmm,
And I could hear the fear at the other end. Oh gosh, oh my gosh, just you by themselves? They walk around the block. I'm like, yeah, me too. I just feel like giving them enough autonomy to develop capacity, right? It's the same thing with like sometimes parents at school will complain like, oh, the playground's not safe enough because there's a new thing on the playground and my daughter, fell and badly skinned her knee. And I'm like, when do you want them
hmm,
to learn like where their limits are? Like now at 11, or do you want to wait until they're driving?
hmm,
Because it's better to bump into things and get some bumps and bruises when you're smaller
yeah.
so that you have a better sense of how to risk and how to be cautious as you get bigger and older and have more capacity to really hurt yourself and others.
That's true. I think, like you said, I mean, it just means less control,
Yeah.
which is hard, I think, because I mean, I don't know about you, but our society really doesn't, you know, give us a false sense of control, that we have more control than we do. We can, if we're on social media, we can change the filter, we can make us look kind of the way we wish we looked in the moment, or we can set up a picture to look like this is exactly where I'm at when you're not really there. You can change your voice so that your voice sounds better than it does. You can, you can, I mean, and none of this is to be offensive, but in the sense of, you can have surgery, you can change how you look. If you don't like something, you can change it. If we have so many grocery stores, you can pick the one that you like best. It's like there's a false sense, I think, of control, but when you really peel it down, there is very little in our control. And so I think in that sense, as an adult with your children, it can become very easy to feel like you can control everything they're doing and keep them safe and create these structures that are going to make sure everything works out fine. And I think it's really hard to let go of that, especially now. And even when you look back at the Waltons, what the episodes you're in and stuff, like the freedom you had and the less, yeah, there were fear about things, but they were like actually things to be worried about, as opposed to fear about walking down the block or fear of letting your daughter go to the store. I guess it's sad in many ways. And it's also sad too that, our world, as you said, we've got this 24 news cycle. And so we're very fearful people. We don't want anything to go wrong.
It, there are people who benefit from fear, right?
Yeah.
Um, and some of it's just a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you put two headlines on somebody's social media feed and one of them is shocking, they're more likely to click on the shocking one than the not shocking one,
Yeah.
right? So I always say if you have a big emotional reaction, pause, because there are too many reasons why the world around you is trying to make you have a big emotional reaction,
Yeah.
because then it gets you to click or to buy or to, whatever it is they want you to do. So when you feel that big wave of like, oh my gosh, that's like, pause and go, is it really? Or am I being manipulated? And anytime no parent has ever had complete control over a child, right? Like in Little House on the Prairie, they would have a massive wood stove in the middle of the kitchen and toddlers crawling around
Yeah.
and so much to do to keep alive that they wouldn't be able to, follow that toddler wherever they went. Children were injured. Children died from the measles and diphtheria. So there's so much they didn't control then too. I
Yeah.
don't I don't think we have more capacity to control. And I don't I mean, I think that all humans wish they could control things.
Yeah.
So I think it's a pretty universal desire. But I think recognizing A, that you can't have perfect control, and B, that the human beings that you're trying to raise need to have some autonomy to develop the capacity to be resilient in the world.
Yeah.
And you're never going to protect your child. I tell parents when they come into middle school, hey, your child is going to have their feelings hurt. There's no way you can't get through sixth grade without somebody hurting your feelings. We're going to do everything we can to keep them safe and to make sure they're not bullied. But will they at some point in time this year come home crying because somebody looked at them funny or somebody called them some name? Probably. That's a universal experience. But us being like, hey, you're going to be okay, and I have every confidence in your ability to get through this, is how they build the resilience to be successful in the world.
Hmm. Well, Cami, I gotta say, this has actually been super encouraging. I mean, I'm not a parent yet, but many of the things you said, I'm like, man, I'm gonna keep this stored away in my parent mental book in my mind. Um, but I'm so grateful for your conversation and just your honesty. And it's funny, you said I parent realistically and you speak realistically too. I can tell you've done this so many times with parents. Um, so, I mean, I just really appreciate this time and the advice you've given. And for listeners, I mean, I think this is going to be very beneficial for more than just getting to meet you as someone who was in the Waltons, but like a lot of your parenting tips, I think are very, very important to hear.
Well, it was fun to talk about. I feel sort of bad, like I didn't give you nearly enough Walton's content. But
That's
I'm on Facebook and I answer fans' questions. So if anybody listening hears this and goes, but what about the Waltons? If they go to Facebook or YouTube, like there's information, like Judy, who played Mary Ellen, has a whole YouTube channel, and I have a couple videos explaining things. And then I really do answer questions on Facebook. So if people didn't get their Walton fix, then I offer them those things as a compensation.
no, do not worry. The point of this is to get to know you. As you said, you're more than Elizabeth Walton. So it's been really neat to get to talk to you.
Well, this was fun for me. It's always exciting being asked new questions.
Good. Well, I hope you have a good day and thanks so much.
My pleasure.